that arise. One of them a little paradoxical and related to the time and place that we've been exploring over these last days. And the other story is to prepare the way for our next meeting. The first story is that story about wisdom and luck. They happened to meet on the road one day, and at first their talk together was very amicable, because after all they were entities abiding in the world together this time. But then they got into quite an argument about who was the most powerful. So just at that moment, in a far-off place, a baby boy was born, and it was decided that one of them would enter into him. So they tossed a coin, and it was Wisdom who was going to enter this boy. Well, this boy was given the name Yusuf. Now, from a very, very early age, Yusuf showed signs of being very, very clever. But not only was he clever, but he was very wise beyond his years. And when he displayed these talents, of course it wasn't long when it was time for him to go out into the world of work, for him to be taken on as an apprentice at the local goldsmith's shop. And there he learned the ways of metal, gold and silver, alchemy, in fact. You know how that is, alchemy. So he learned the ways of working with metals and making designs and wonderful jewelry. But you know, after some while, Yusuf got a little tired of doing this, and he decided to go on the road. And he thought that he should go right to the capital city, right where the Sultan himself lived. So he headed for the city, and before long he found himself in the employ of no less than the Sultan's tailor himself. Now, like with his goldsmithing, it was very soon found that he had a very great talent for designing and making clothing. And so, to the great delight of the Sultan, he was given clothes that had great display. But you know the way of the world. The tailor who had employed him, when the Sultan asked, "Who is designing these clothes?" Of course the tailor said, "Oh, it was me." But this didn't bother Yusuf at all. But as it happened, the princess of the realm, the daughter of the Sultan, had come to marriageable age. And when the Sultan approached her about finding a suitable husband for her, the princess, who was quite a strong-minded young woman, said, "I will only marry the man who can make me speak." And from that moment on, she spoke not a word. So the Sultan sent out messages far and wide to invite a suitable suitor who could make his daughter speak. But if they didn't, they would lose their head. Well, there were many, a prince and others, who came and were unsuccessful in making this maiden speak. So their heads were severed from their shoulders. But then it came to the ears of Yusuf, and he said, "I can make her speak. I will marry the princess. So he took himself off to the palace. Well, you know, as it was previously, when the suitor came in to the princess's presence, there were always servants who were there to witness, to make sure that it was all above board. So when Yusuf came and presented himself and stated that he could make the princess, well, of course everyone laughed at him. He was wearing just the simple costume of a tailor, an ordinary person. But, you know, an edict was an edict, and it was said that whoever could make her speak would indeed marry her. So Yusuf was brought into the presence of the princess, and there were the witnesses sitting there waiting. But the witnesses, the servants looked at him, looked him up and down and said, "Oh, his head will roll." But Yusuf came in to the room and he looked around, and instead of addressing himself to the princess, he looked up and spoke to the chandelier. He said, "Chandelier," he said, I have a conundrum for you. I have a question. Perhaps you can help me in finding the answer." He said, there were 3 men. One was a woodcarver, one was a tailor, and the other was a teacher. And times were very poor in their village, so they decided to go out into the world to see if they could better themselves. But they came to a forest, and they knew that in the forest there were wild animals. So they decided that while 2 of them slept, one would keep guard just to make sure that they were not caught by wild animals. So, as it happened, it was the woodcarver who was to be on guard first. The other 2 went peacefully to sleep. But of course, sitting there through the night, the woodcarver got very bored. So he took a piece of wood, and he took his very sharp knife, and he began to carve. And he found himself carving a maiden, the form of a maiden. Naked, of course. Well, it was time for him to wake up one of his friends, so he woke up the tailor. And the tailor came on guard, but he too was bored, and then he looked and he saw, oh, a maiden. So he took his bolt of cloth, which he always carried with him, and his needle and thread, and he made a beautiful costume for her, a beautiful dress for her. And then it was time for him to wake up his final companion, the teacher. And so the teacher was on guard, and he saw this beautiful maiden, and he spoke to her, but she didn't reply. So he thought, I'm a teacher, I can teach her to speak. And so he spent the last hours of the morning teaching the maiden, and he was successful. So when his companions woke up, there was a beautiful maiden who could speak. Well, of course, they all claimed her. The woodcarver said, I made her, so she's mine. The tailor said, I dressed her, so she's mine. And the teacher said, I made her speak, so she's mine. Yusuf said, Chandelier, who do you think she belonged to? And of course, the princess couldn't resist. She said, oh, of course, the man who made her speak. But you know what? The servants had gone to sleep, so they didn't hear the princess speak. So, when they woke up, of course, looking at this simple, ordinary man, they thought he couldn't have made her speak, so they hauled him off to have his head lopped. So they came to the guillotine down in the courtyard, and there was Yusuf with his head on the block. And just at that moment, luck came along. and said, "Look, wisdom, you see what you've done? You see what a mess you've made of all of this? Now let me take over." So he did. And just right at that moment, the princess came out onto her balcony, which overlooked the courtyard, and looked down to see her beloved, who had made her speak, about to have his head lopped. He said, "No, no, 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 that is my potential husband. You cannot kill him." So, of course, we know the rest of the story. Yusuf married the princess, and they lived happily ever after and had many sons. But then wisdom and luck, of course, came together, and luck said to wisdom, "You see, I'm more powerful than you because..." What's that got to do with time and place? Yes? Time and place. I'll let you finish the story. But a little anecdote. Many years ago, when I first would visit Brunei on the island of Borneo, having many Chinese friends, about 50 or 60 people used to come in the beginning to the gatherings. But you know, the Bruneians, the Chinese, are very superstitious people. They had a lot to do with the occult. You know, they love to boil water with their powers and all of these kind of things. But when I first went there, I would say to them that when you embark on the spiritual path, you have to give up everything. So, as it happened, there was a young couple there who were having financial problems. They lost their house, they lost their business, they lost everything. And they told all of the people who would gather there that it was my fault. Because that's what I'd said, you have to give up everything. So when I went back the next time, only a handful of people were there because 45 or 50 of them had bought tickets to Thailand to go over and pray and see the monks and burn incense so that they could expunge themselves of my energy. So there's a story. There's a story of a dervish, Sufi story. And this dervish had about 50 or 60 followers. But he said to his followers one day, "It's time for me to teach you another lesson, an initiation of sorts, you might say." So he explained that they would go on a journey. But he said, "I have to teach you something first. I'm going to teach you that when I raise my arms up in the air, you must shout, 'I must die in place of the dervish.'" Well, they all got together and had a discussion about this. And they said, "Well, what is he trying to do? Maybe they want him to be a scapegoat. We're going to be a scapegoat for him." So 59 of them decided to part his company. So there was only one follower who decided to go on this journey with the dervish. And they traveled for a long, long way until they came in to another realm. But as it happened, that kingdom had just been taken over by a cruel tyrant. And that tyrant gave an order that to make the people afraid of him, to realize that he meant business, that they would have to kowtow to him, that his soldiers should pick up any traveler on the road they could find so that they could make an example of him. So as it happened, the poor dervish was the one that the soldiers took. So his follower quickly followed on. But there was this tyrant with his band of fierce soldiers who wanted to make an example of the dervish to frighten the populace. So they set up an execution stand, and they took the dervish up to the execution stand where they were going to use the sword to lop his head. When the dervish raised his hands, and just as he'd been taught to do, his follower shouted, "I must die in place of the dervish." Well, the tyrant and his soldiers were totally, somebody who wants to die instead of, what's going on here? So the tyrant consulted with his soldiers, what does all this mean? The soldiers said, well, we really don't know, but, you know, perhaps you could ask the dervish. So the tyrant turned round to the dervish. He said, well, why is it that you both want to die? Why is this argument about who's to die? Oh, said the dervish, it has been foretold that at this time and in this place, the person who dies will immediately become immortal. Oh, said the tyrant, if anyone's going to become immortal, it's going to be me. Well, kill me. And so they did. And all his soldiers had the same thought. Well, if this is the time and place to die, well, kill me also. So they finished killing each other. But you know what? There was a state of total confusion. And that's when the dervish and his follower left.